Welcome to the story of the murder on the Midnight Express. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1, The Midnight Express. The winter of 1895 had settled upon Europe with a severity that the oldest railwaymen could not recall in living memory. Snow had choked the mountain passes since early December, and the evening we departed for the continent, a bitter wind drove flurries across the platform of Victoria Station, like white sand across a desert floor. I recall the gaslights above the concourse swaying on their chains, casting restless shadows, and I recall the particular expression upon the face of my friend Sherlock Holmes, that look of keen, restless dissatisfaction which I had come to recognize as the symptom of a mind insufficiently occupied. "You are in poor spirits, Holmes," I remarked as we passed beneath the iron archway toward our platform. "Travel is merely the relocation of ennui, Watson, unless something of interest presents itself along the way." He shifted the strap of his leather bag. "Still, the journey has one redeeming feature. I've been reading a monograph on the physics of moving bodies, specifically how objects behave under constant velocity as opposed to sudden deceleration. A moving train is a rather elegant laboratory for such principles. I had learned long ago that Holmes's idle academic digressions often proved to be anything but idle. I merely nodded and followed him toward the waiting train. The Midnight Express was among the finest night services on the continental routes, a sleeper of considerable luxury, with polished mahogany panelling, brass fittings gleaming beneath corridor lamps, and compartments upholstered in deep burgundy velvet. It was bound for the Alpine passes, with stops at Strasbourg, Basel, and ultimately Innsbruck. Holmes had accepted an invitation from an Austrian colleague to consult upon forged securities in Salzburg, and I had been glad to accompany him, for the damp London winter had done nothing for the old wound in my shoulder. We found our first-class compartment and settled in. Holmes arranged his things with that fastidiousness he reserved for confined spaces. Pipe on the window ledge, magnifying glass in his inner pocket, his slim volume propped against the reading lamp. I was hanging my overcoat when the first of our fellow passengers passed our open door. He was a tall, lean man of 60, with the rigid bearing of a soldier and the complexion of decades in foreign climates. His moustache was clipped to military precision. A heavy trunk was being loaded into his compartment 2 doors down, and the porter struggled visibly with its weight. "Colonel retired," Holmes murmured, without looking up. "Indian service." The trunk contained something metallic, a firearm collection given the low-centered weight distribution. He packs his revolver at the bottom out of habit, not concealment. The colonel noticed my gaze, fixed me with a cold stare that carried the unmistakable warning of a man who valued his privacy above all courtesies, and moved on without a word. The second passenger did not so much appear as arrive in the manner of a stage entrance. She was a woman of striking beauty, perhaps 35, with dark hair swept beneath a velvet travelling hat and a bearing that commanded the corridor. As she passed our door, I caught the trace of an unusual perfume. Rich, heavy, faintly exotic. Holmes's nostrils flared. His grey eyes followed her until she disappeared into a compartment further along. "Hungarian," he said quietly. "The perfume is distinctive, tuberose and black amber, a blend produced by a small number of perfumeries in Budapest. She is a singer, I should think. Opera. I noticed a programme for Vienna's Hofoper protruding from her handbag. She's likely travelling to perform." "You deduce that from a woman walking past our door?" "I observed it, Watson. There is a difference." The platform whistle sounded, and the Midnight Express shuddered into motion. Over the next quarter hour, I observed several more passengers making their way toward the dining car. There was a nervous, thin-faced man of 45 clutching his medical bag. A physician, Holmes confirmed, noting a chemical stain on his cuff and an anxious disposition suggesting personal troubles. There was a young Frenchwoman of 30 with paint beneath her fingernails and an expression of barely contained fury, carrying a leather portfolio with protective vigilance. An artist transporting her own work, Holmes remarked. Oils, cadmium yellow and Prussian blue. The portfolio clasp has been opened obsessively. She's not merely transporting paintings, she's worried about them. And then there was the man who would be dead before morning. He was perhaps 50, solidly built, with the florid complexion of one who lived well but slept poorly. His suit was excellent but worn carelessly, a button unfastened, collar askew. He carried a leather document case gripped so tightly his knuckles were white and his eyes moved restlessly, scanning the corridor. "Arthur Bellamy," Holmes said. "Private investments, continental dealings. The document case contains papers of considerable importance. You will have noticed the grip." He seemed agitated. More than agitated. That man is afraid. Not of anything so impersonal as a storm. A fifth passenger appeared, a man of impeccable dress who walked with the quiet confidence of established wealth. Silver grey hair, closely trimmed beard, a Viennese suit of precise cut. His hands bore ink stains on the right forefinger and thumb. "A banker," Holmes remarked. "Viennese, private practice. The ink stains are fresh and extensive, intensive correspondence under pressure. The cufflinks are silver, monogrammed." The silver cufflinks caught the lamplight, matched, gleaming, each bearing an engraved monogram I could not read at that distance. At 9:30 we proceeded to the dining car. It was a handsome space, white tablecloths starched to perfection, crystal glasses that trembled faintly with the train's vibrations, and the warm glow of shaded electric lamps that gave the whole car the intimate atmosphere of a private club. Nearly all the first-class passengers had gathered. The colonel sat alone with whiskey, brooding. The physician fidgeted nearby. Mademoiselle Sophie Delacroix sketched furiously between courses, and Madame Elena Varga, the Hungarian singer, conversed with effortless charm at a centre table, her perfume faintly discernible even across the car. It was Bellamy who drew me most. He sat alone near the far wall, barely touching his food. His wine stood untouched. The document case rested at arm's reach. He stared out the darkened window, and his reflection stared back with hollow eyes. At 10 o'clock, the Viennese banker, Victor Holden, rose and sat uninvited at Bellamy's table. Bellamy stiffened. For several minutes their conversation appeared civil, but the civility was performance. Bellamy's jaw was set. Holden's smile never reached his eyes. By 10:30, the pretense had collapsed. Bellamy's voice rose, not enough for the words to carry, but enough that heads turned. The colonel looked up. Dr. Price froze mid-sip. Sophie paused mid-sketch. Bellamy said something sharp. I caught only the word evidence, then stood, seized his case, and left without a backward glance. Holden remained seated. He adjusted his napkin, took a measured sip of wine, and resumed eating as though nothing had occurred. Only the faintest tension in his jaw betrayed him. Holmes set down his cup. His expression had sharpened into that keen, predatory focus I knew well. That was not a disagreement between acquaintances, he said. It was a confrontation between men with a shared secret, and the secret is in that document case. Bellamy is carrying proof of something that frightens Holden considerably more than Holden wishes to show. Over the next quarter hour, the dining car emptied. Elena Varga departed first, her perfume lingering after her, that same tuberose and black amber. Holmes's nostrils twitched as the scent reached us. Dr. Price left shortly after, dabbing his brow. The colonel remained, drinking steadily. Sophie snapped her notebook shut and stalked out. As we returned to our compartment, the train had begun its mountain ascent. Through frosted windows I saw dark pine forests rushing past, their branches heavy with snow, and above them the dim, jagged outlines of peaks lost in cloud. The snow was falling harder now, a thick flake streaming horizontally past the glass, and the wind had risen to a pitch that made the carriage groan upon its springs. We paused outside Bellamy's compartment. The door was ajar. Through the gap, I saw him hunched over the writing desk, his pen moving rapidly. The document case lay open. I glimpsed financial ledgers and correspondence. He did not look up. Holmes stood motionless, watching. Then he turned. "Come, Watson. I have a feeling the morning will bring something more stimulating than Alpine scenery." I changed into nightclothes and settled into my berth, but sleep was slow. The wind shrieked against the windows and the train rocked as the gradient steepened. Holmes sat by the window in his dressing gown, pipe unlit, watching the snow stream past. "You are thinking about Bellamy," I said. "I am thinking about several things. The physics of moving bodies, the nature of fear, and the question of what a man does when he is cornered in a confined space with the very person he fears most." He paused. "But yes, principally I am thinking about Bellamy." I extinguished my lamp. Outside, the mountains closed around us, and the storm swallowed the world. The last thing I heard before sleep took me was the steady rhythm of the train, carrying us onward through the darkness toward whatever waited in the morning. Chapter 2. Storm over the mountains. I do not know how long I slept. It could not have been more than an hour, for when I woke the train was still climbing, and the storm had grown considerably worse. The wind no longer merely shrieked, it howled, a deep and sustained fury that pressed against the carriage walls with physical weight. Through the rattling window I could see nothing at all. The world beyond the glass had been reduced to blackness, broken only by the frantic passage of snow caught in the feeble glow of the corridor lamps. Holmes's berth was empty. His dressing gown hung on the hook, which meant he had dressed again, a sure sign that sleep held no interest for him. His Kirchhoff monograph lay open and face down on the seat, a pencil resting in the spine where he had been making annotations. I pulled on my trousers and jacket and stepped into the corridor. The train was a different creature at this hour. The mahogany panelling that had seemed warm during boarding now gleamed darkly in reduced lamplight, and the corridor stretched in both directions with the narrow or coffin-like proportions that only railway carriages possess. The floor swayed beneath my feet. Somewhere ahead, a loose fitting rattled with metronomic persistence, and the joints between carriages groaned like the timbers of a ship in heavy weather. I found Holmes in the dining car. The space had been cleared and dimmed, tablecloths replaced with plain covers, electric lamps turned down to soft amber that left the corners in shadow. But it was not entirely empty. 3 figures remained, each occupying their own island of solitude, and Holmes sat apart from all of them, nursing black coffee at a table near the far end, his long legs crossed and his eyes moving with that restless, cataloguing precision I knew well. Colonel Rathbone occupied the same corner table. His whiskey tumbler was nearly empty, another beside it already drained. His face had settled into such rigid private desolation that I felt almost ashamed to observe it. He stared at the black window as though conducting a conversation with his own reflection, and losing. Dr. Price sat 2 tables away, his medical bag open beside him. He was rummaging through it with furtive urgency, his forehead glistening with perspiration despite the chill. He extracted a small brown bottle, measured a dose into a glass of water with trembling hands, and drank it in a single swallow. A stomach preparation, I judged, but the secrecy struck me as excessive for so ordinary an ailment. Sophie Delacroix sat by the window nearest the corridor entrance, her pencil moving across her sketchbook with furious, slashing strokes. She was not drawing the scenery, but working from memory, her brow furrowed with a concentration that bordered on anger. I joined Holmes. He acknowledged me with a slight inclination of his head. The Colonel has consumed 4 whiskies and spoken to no one, he said quietly. He is drinking to suppress something. A memory, given the way his hand tightens on the glass each time the train jolts. The physician has been self-medicating for a gastric complaint he is embarrassed about, and Mademoiselle Delacroix has been sketching the same subject for 20 minutes with increasing violence. A man's face, though she tears each attempt from the book before completing it. Bellamy's face? Almost certainly. He paused. But none of these observations are what brought me here. I have been waiting. For what? For her? The corridor door opened, and Elena Varga entered the dining car. She had changed into a simpler travelling costume of dark green, but her bearing remained that of a woman accustomed to the stage. She moved through the dimmed car with unhurried grace, and every head turned. The Colonel's with reluctant attention, Dr. Price's with startled awareness, Sophie's with undisguised suspicion. Only Holmes watched without appearing to watch, his gaze on his coffee cup, while his peripheral attention tracked her every movement. She approached our table. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I find I cannot sleep in this dreadful storm. May I impose upon you for company?" "You are most welcome, Madame Varga," Holmes replied, rising briefly. She sat. Up close I was struck again by the unusual perfume, that rich blend of tuberose and black amber that seemed to emanate from her as naturally as warmth from a hearth. Holmes inhaled once, slowly, deliberately, through his nose, and filed whatever information the scent provided into that vast mental catalogue of his. "You are travelling to Vienna for a performance, I understand," Holmes said. "Tosca," Elena replied, and something in her dark eyes flickered. "You know the opera, Mr. Holmes?" "I know it well. Puccini's tale of murder and political deception. A woman trapped between powerful men, forced to desperate action." "You describe it accurately. Tosca kills the villain to save the man she loves. It is a story about what people will do when they are cornered." She smiled. "A story about murder and deception, Mr. Holmes. I trust you find such things dull." "On the contrary, I find the mechanics of deception endlessly fascinating, particularly the gap between what a performance intends to convey and what it inadvertently reveals. If the remark unsettled her, she did not show it. She laughed, a low, musical sound, and turned the conversation to lighter matters, the quality of the train's wine cellar, the tedium of winter travel, a droll anecdote about a tenor who had forgotten his lines during the second act of La Bohème. She was extraordinarily charming. Her wit was quick, her timing impeccable, and she possessed that rare gift of making her companions feel as though they were the most interesting people in the room. And yet I sensed, beneath the performance, a watchfulness that mirrored Holmes's own. Her eyes moved to the corridor door each time it opened. Her fingers were not entirely still. And once, when the train lurched violently and a distant door banged shut in the sleeping carriages, she turned her head with a sharpness that no amount of theatrical poise could disguise. Holmes noticed it too. I saw his eyes narrow fractionally before his expression returned to polite interest. After 15 minutes, Eleanor excused herself. "The storm will exhaust itself eventually. I must rest my voice for Vienna. Good night, gentlemen." She departed. Her perfume remained, a ghost of tuberose and black amber lingering above our table. Holmes sat motionless, his coffee untouched, his eyes on the door through which she had vanished. "A remarkable woman," I offered. "A remarkable performance," Holmes corrected quietly. "There is a distinction, Watson, and it is precisely what interests me. Madame Varga is an actress of the highest calibre, not merely upon the stage, but in every interaction. Every gesture is measured. Every word is placed. She revealed nothing she did not intend to reveal." "And what did she intend to reveal?" "That she is charming, cultivated, and entirely at ease, which is itself revealing. because no one aboard this train should be entirely at ease tonight. Bellamy is afraid. The Colonel is drowning his conscience. Dr. Price is hiding a complaint. Mademoiselle Delacroix is consumed by rage. But Elena Varga is serene. He paused. Serenity, in the present circumstances, is the most suspicious disposition of all. The Colonel rose unsteadily and departed, his boots thudding with the deliberate precision of a man determined not to show how much he had drunk. Dr. Price had already gone, his face still damp. Sophie remained, sketching with diminished fury. Holmes rose abruptly. "Come, I wish to walk the train once more." We passed through the swaying corridors of the sleeping carriages. Lamps had been turned to their lowest setting, casting pools of amber at intervals along the floor, and leaving the spaces between in near darkness. Doors were shut and latched on every side. We passed Elena's compartment, firmly closed, no light beneath it. The faintest trace of her perfume hung in the corridor, whether lingering from her passage or seeping beneath the door I could not tell. We passed Holden's compartment, dark, silent. Holmes paused for the briefest moment, his head tilted as though listening, then moved on. And then we reached Bellamy's door. It was still ajar. The reading lamp burned. But Bellamy was no longer at the writing desk. He sat in the chair beside it, head bowed, hands clasped between his knees, the attitude of a man who has finished a difficult task and now contemplates what comes next. The document case was closed and fastened, resting on the desk beside a neat stack of sealed envelopes. He had been writing letters, and the number of them suggested a man putting his affairs in order. Holmes studied the scene with an intensity that made me uneasy. After a long moment, he drew back. "He has prepared his evidence," he murmured as we continued. "The letters are addressed and sealed. He means to deliver them upon arrival. To authorities, I should think. Whatever hold Bellamy has over Holden, he intends to use it the moment this train reaches its destination. You believe Holden is in serious trouble? I believe Bellamy has documents that could destroy Holden entirely, and I believe Holden knows it." He paused at our door. "The question is, what a desperate man does when he is trapped on a moving train with the instrument of his ruin, and the mountains outside offer no escape, and the hours until the station are running out." He stepped inside. The window showed nothing but swirling white, and the train groaned as it pushed deeper into the pass. The locomotive sounded its whistle, a mournful note swallowed instantly by the wind. "Get what sleep you can," Holmes said, settling into his chair. "I suspect the morning will be eventful." I lay in my berth and listened to the storm. The train rocked and swayed, and from somewhere deep in the locomotive came a rhythmic, shuddering pulse that vibrated through the floor and walls of every carriage. It was like being inside a living creature, fighting its way through the mountains by sheer force of will. Holmes did not sleep. Each time I opened my eyes, he sat in the same position, by the window, his profile sharp against the faint glow, his gaze fixed upon the storm. The last time I looked, his lips were moving silently, counting something. Seconds, perhaps, or the intervals between the train's oscillations. Then his eyes closed, not in sleep, but in concentration, and he was still. Outside, the mountains waited. The storm raged, and the midnight express pressed on. Chapter 3. The sudden stop. The sound that woke me was not a sound at all. It was a sensation, a violent, a wrenching deceleration that seized the entire train like a fist closing around a throat. One moment I was in the shallow waters of an uneasy sleep. The next I was airborne, hurled from my berth with such force that I struck the opposite wall shoulder first and crumpled to the floor in a tangle of blankets and limbs. The noise came after, a shriek of metal against metal, the scream of brakes applied beyond their tolerance, and beneath it all a deep, shuddering groan as though the Midnight Express itself were crying out in pain. My medical bag crashed from the overhead rack and burst open, scattering instruments across the floor. The reading lamp swung wildly on its chain before the bulb shattered, plunging the compartment into darkness broken only by the faint, snow-reflected glow from the window. Somewhere in the train, glass broke, and I heard it distinctly, a sharp, crystalline crash followed by the tinkling scatter of fragments. Then voices, a woman's cry, muffled and distant, the deeper shout of a man, the rapid thudding of footsteps in the corridor. "Watson," Holmes's voice came from somewhere above me, perfectly steady. "Are you injured?" I took stock. My shoulder throbbed where it had struck the wall, and my left knee had connected with the edge of the berth frame, but nothing was broken. "Bruised," I said. "Nothing worse. What on earth happened?" "Emergency braking. Snow on the tracks, almost certainly. We are in the steepest section of the mountain pass." I heard him moving in the darkness, and then a match flared, illuminating his face. He was standing braced against the window frame, entirely composed. He had not been thrown from his position. I realized, with some irritation, that he had likely anticipated the stop, or at least prepared for it, and had wedged himself into his chair accordingly. He lit the corridor lamp above our door. The warm amber glow revealed the compartment in disarray. My belongings scattered. Holmes's coffee cup in fragments on the floor, the curtain torn from one of its rings. But Holmes himself was immaculate, his waistcoat still buttoned, his expression one of sharp, alert interest. The train had stopped completely. Through the window I could see nothing but the white fury of the blizzard, and I could feel the absolute stillness of the carriages, that unnatural absence of motion after hours of constant movement. The corridor was chaos. Passengers emerged in various states of undress and alarm. The Colonel stood in his doorway in shirt-sleeves, my expression thunderous. Dr. Price stumbled out, clutching his forehead, where a thin line of blood traced from a cut at his temple. Sophie Delacroix appeared in a dressing gown, looking more furious than frightened. The conductor, a sturdy Swiss named Gruber, came hurrying through, his lantern swinging, assuring passengers in German, then French, then halting English, that the stop was precautionary and the crew were clearing snow from the tracks. "How long?" the Colonel demanded. "1 hour, perhaps 2. The storm is very bad." The Colonel retreated. Dr. Price pressed his handkerchief to his temple and did the same. Holmes observed all of this from our doorway, cataloguing who had emerged, in what order, and in what condition. Then Gruber continued his rounds, knocking on each door. He reached the far end of the carriage. He knocked on Bellamy's door. No response. He knocked again, louder. Monsieur Bellamy, are you well?" Silence. Gruber tried the handle. The door was not latched. It swung inward, and the light from his lantern fell across the threshold. I heard the conductor's sharp intake of breath, a sound that cut through the murmur of the corridor with the precision of a scalpel. He said something in German, a single word, and then stepped back from the door with his hand pressed to his mouth. Holmes moved immediately. He was down the corridor before I had taken 3 steps, his long stride covering the distance in seconds. I followed, my medical instincts overriding my still aching limbs, and we arrived at Bellamy's compartment together. The scene within was this. Arthur Bellamy lay face down upon the floor of his compartment, his right arm extended, his left folded beneath his body. Blood had pooled around his head, a dark, spreading stain on the carpet that glistened in the lamplight. His temple had struck the corner of the writing desk, and the wound was deep, the bone visible. Broken glass lay scattered around him, the remnants of a drinking tumbler, and the compartment was in considerable disarray. The chair was overturned. A book had fallen from the shelf. The reading lamp still burned, casting its steady light upon the dead man's back. The writing desk itself was undisturbed. The document case and the sealed letters I had glimpsed earlier remained where Bellamy had placed them. Whatever had killed him, it was not robbery. The conductor's immediate conclusion was plain upon his face. "The breaking," he said, his English faltering. "The sudden stop. He has fallen. He has struck his head. Mon Dieu, the poor man." Several passengers had gathered behind us in the corridor. I heard Sophie's voice. "Is he dead?" And the Colonel's heavy breathing. Dr. Price appeared at my shoulder, his own injury forgotten, and I stepped aside to let him enter. Price knelt beside the body. His hands were trembling, but his examination was competent. He checked the pulse at the wrist and throat, lifted one eyelid, and then carefully turned the head to examine the wound. "Dead," he confirmed. "Blunt force trauma to the right temple. The impact with the desk corner was catastrophic. I should estimate death was nearly instantaneous." He looked up. "Consistent with a fall during the emergency braking. If he was standing when the train stopped, the force would have been more than sufficient." There were murmurs of horror and sympathy from the corridor. The conductor crossed himself. The Colonel said nothing, but I noticed his jaw tighten. Holmes had not entered the compartment. He stood in the doorway, absolutely motionless, his eyes moving across the scene with the slow, methodical sweep I had witnessed 100 times before. It was the gaze of a man not merely looking, but reading, a document written in a language only he could comprehend. His eyes moved from the body to the blood to the broken glass. They lingered on the glass for a long moment, longer than seemed warranted. Then they moved to the writing desk, to the overturned chair, to the reading lamp. They moved to the compartment door itself, the frame, the latch, the narrow gap between the door and its housing. I saw his fingers reach out and touch the metal of the latch plate, running his thumb along its edge. He frowned, the faintest contraction of his brow, but said nothing. He stepped back into the corridor. "Dr. Watson," he said, his voice carrying the clipped authority that signalled his professional mode. "Would you be so good as to examine the body? I should like your independent assessment." I entered the compartment and knelt where Price had knelt. The blood was still warm. The wound to the temple was as Price had described, a deep, crushing impact consistent with the sharp corner of the desk. The angle was plausible for a forward fall. But as I examined the back of Bellamy's head, I found a second point of injury, a contusion at the base of the skull, above the occipital bone. It was less visible than the temple wound, partially hidden by the thickness of Bellamy's hair, and it had not bled as freely. But it was there. "There are 2 points of impact," I reported, looking up at Holmes. "The temple wound from the desk corner, and a second contusion at the back of the skull." "Consistent with a fall?" Holmes asked. I considered. A man thrown forward by the breaking might strike his face or temple on the desk. But the back of his skull? That would require a different trajectory entirely, a blow from behind, or a secondary impact as he fell backward before pitching forward. It was not impossible, but it was unusual. "Possible," I said carefully, "but awkward. The geometry is not straightforward." Holmes nodded, as though I had confirmed something he already knew. He turned to the conductor. "Herr Gruber, I must ask that this compartment be sealed, and no one is to enter until I have completed a thorough examination. The body is not to be moved." Gruber looked uncertain. "But, monsieur, it was an accident. The breaking." "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Perhaps not. In either case, the scene must be preserved." His tone left no room for negotiation. The corridor had grown quiet. The gathered passengers watched Holmes with expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Dr. Price had retreated several steps, his face pale. The Colonel stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Holmes with an intensity I could not interpret. Sophie had pressed herself against the far wall, her hand over her mouth. And further down the corridor, standing apart from the others, I glimpsed 2 figures who had arrived without my noticing. Elena Varga composed and still in her dark green travelling dress, and Victor Halden, immaculate as ever, his expression one of polished concern. Holmes's gaze swept across them all. It rested on each face for a fraction of a second, long enough to register what was there, and more importantly, what was not. Then he turned back to the compartment. He stood in the doorway for a final, long moment, studying the broken glass on the floor. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed together, and then he stepped back and pulled the door shut. We walked in silence to our compartment. Holmes closed the door behind us and stood with his back to it, his hands clasped behind him, his expression one of controlled intensity. "Well?" I asked. "What do you think?" He was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was low and precise. "The glass is wrong, Watson." "Wrong? How?" He did not answer immediately. He crossed to the window and stared out at the storm, which raged on as though nothing of consequence had occurred within the steel shell of the Midnight Express. When he turned back, his grey eyes held that particular light, sharp, cold, and utterly certain, that I had learned to associate with the opening moves of a very serious game. "That was not an accident," he said. "Arthur Bellamy was murdered, and the killer is still on this train." Chapter 4. Holmes begins to doubt. I did not sleep again that night. Holmes's declaration hung in the darkness like a blade suspended by a thread, and every sound the train made seemed charged with sinister meaning. A man had been murdered 20 yards from where I lay, and his killer was breathing the same air, separated from us by nothing more than wood and velvet. Holmes appeared energized. The restless dissatisfaction that had plagued him since Victoria Station had vanished, replaced by a focused, predatory calm. He sat with his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, and did not speak again until the first grey light of morning seeped through the frosted windows. "Watson," he said, as though continuing a conversation that had never paused, "I'm going to examine the compartment. You may accompany me if you wish, but I must ask you to touch nothing and to remain silent unless I address you directly." I dressed quickly. The train had resumed its crawl through the mountains, and the storm had begun to exhaust itself. Through the windows I could see snow-covered peaks emerging from retreating cloud. The corridor was empty. The lamps turned up again. Gruber, the conductor, was standing guard outside Bellamy's compartment, as Holmes had instructed. The man looked haggard. He had clearly not slept either, and he admitted us with a brief, unhappy nod. Holmes thanked him, stepped inside, and closed the door behind us. The compartment was exactly as we had left it. Bellamy's body remained on the floor, covered now with a white sheet that Gruber had placed over him at some point during the night. The blood had darkened to a deep brown. The broken glass still lay scattered across the carpet. The overturned chair, the fallen book, the reading lamp still burning, all untouched. Holmes removed his coat, folded it precisely, and set it on the berth. Then he produced his magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket and went to work. He began with a glass. He crouched beside the shards, his knees on the carpet, and studied them with the lens for a full 2 minutes without moving. Then he produced a white handkerchief from his pocket, spread it flat on the floor beside the glass, and used a pencil to trace the outline of the dispersal pattern, marking the position of each significant fragment with small dots on the cloth. "Watson," he said, without looking up, "when this train braked last night, in which direction were the passengers thrown?" "Forward," I said immediately. My bruised shoulder was sufficient testimony. Toward the front of the train. The deceleration was violent. "Precisely. Every unsecured object on this train was thrown forward. Your medical bag, my coffee cup, books from shelves, passengers from their seats. The laws of physics are not negotiable. A body in motion tends to remain in motion until acted upon by an external force. When the train decelerated, everything that was not fixed in place continued forward." "Yes." "Then consider this glass." He gestured with his pencil. If this tumbler had been knocked from the table during the breaking by Bellamy's hand or by the jolt itself, the shards would have scattered predominantly forward. Toward the front wall of the compartment, there would be a directional bias in the dispersal consistent with the momentum of the train at the moment of braking. I looked at the glass. Even without the magnifying lens, I could see what he meant. The shards were spread in a rough circle around the point of impact, evenly distributed in all directions. There was no clustering toward the front of the compartment, and no directional bias whatsoever. This glass, Holmes continued, rising to his feet, was broken while the train was moving at constant speed. There was no deceleration acting upon it at the moment of impact. The fragments fell where gravity alone dictated, straight down and outward from the point of contact with the floor. The implication struck me like a physical blow. Bellamy was already dead when the train stopped. Precisely. Holmes's voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. The glass was smashed deliberately, placed on the floor and broken by hand, or dropped from standing height, while the train was still moving at its normal cruising velocity. It was staged, Watson. Someone killed Bellamy, arranged the scene to look as though he had fallen during the breaking, and smashed the glass to complete the illusion. They then waited for the emergency stop, which, on this route in winter, was all but inevitable, and allowed the train's own physics to provide their alibi. He moved to the writing desk. The document case and sealed letters remained undisturbed. He opened the case carefully and examined the papers within. Financial ledgers, correspondence on headed notepaper, what appeared to be bank statements bearing the name of a Viennese institution. He did not read them in detail, but noted their presence and closed the case. Not robbery, he confirmed. These papers are worth more than anything else on this train, and they were not touched. The killer wanted Bellamy dead, not his evidence. He turned his attention to the side table beside the upholstered chair. It was a small, polished surface with a circular dust mark where something heavy had recently stood. Holmes measured the circle with his eye. Watson, every first-class compartment on this train is furnished with a heavy brass ashtray bearing the railway company's monogram. I observed them in our own compartment and in the dining car. They are substantial objects, solid brass, perhaps 2 pounds in weight. I looked at the table. The circle in the dust was unmistakable. Something had stood there for the duration of the journey, keeping the surrounding surface clean while dust settled around it. But the object was gone. "The ashtray is missing," I said. "It is. And the wound at the back of Bellamy's skull, the contusion you noted at the base of the occipital bone, is entirely consistent with a blow from precisely such an object. Heavy, blunt, and brought down with force upon the back of an unsuspecting man's head." He paused. "The ashtray is the murder weapon, Watson, and someone has taken it." He moved finally to the door. He crouched at the threshold and examined the latch plate with his magnifying glass, running his fingers along the metal frame with the delicacy of a surgeon. "Here," he said. I knelt beside him. On the brass plate surrounding the latch mechanism there was a fresh scratch, a thin, bright line in the metal, perhaps 2 inches long, running diagonally across the plate's surface. It was recent. The exposed metal beneath the scratch had not yet begun to tarnish. "This was made by a thin, hard instrument, a knife blade or the edge of a coin," Holmes said. "Someone forced this door open from the outside while the latch was engaged. Not fully, just enough to create a gap. The scratch is consistent with levering the latch back through the gap between door and frame." "But why? Bellamy's door was ajar when we passed earlier in the evening." "It was ajar when we passed at approximately 11:30. But Bellamy may well have latched it afterward, before retiring to his chair to contemplate his sealed letters and his morning appointment with the Austrian authorities. If the door was latched, the killer needed to force it open without knocking, without being admitted, without Bellamy knowing." He stood and surveyed the compartment one final time. His nostrils flared slightly, that same deliberate inhalation I had observed when Elena Varga passed our compartment on the previous evening. "There is something else," he said. "A scent. A faint, nearly overwhelmed by the blood and the carbolic from Dr. Price's examination, but present nonetheless." I inhaled. I could detect nothing beyond the metallic tang of dried blood and the stale air of the closed compartment. "I cannot place it yet," Holmes admitted, "but I have encountered it recently, and I shall identify it before the day is out." He collected his coat from the berth and put it on. We stepped into the corridor, and he pulled the door shut behind us, instructing Gruber once more that no one was to enter. We walked back to our compartment. The mountains were fully visible now, vast, white, indifferent, and the train crept along the valley floor. Holmes stood at the window and assembled his findings aloud. "The facts are these. Arthur Bellamy was struck on the back of the head with a heavy brass ashtray, the standard furnishing of his own compartment, by someone standing behind him while he was seated and facing away from the door. The blow was fatal, or nearly so. His subsequent fall drove his temple into the corner of the writing desk, which completed the work. The killer then staged the scene, overturned the chair, smashed a drinking glass on the floor, and arranged the body to suggest a fall during the train's emergency braking. The ashtray, the murder weapon, was removed from the compartment. The killer knew, or reasonably expected, that the storm would cause an emergency stop on this section of the route, and timed the murder accordingly." "It is fiendishly clever," I said. "It is better than clever, Watson. It is designed not merely to conceal a murder, but to prevent anyone from recognizing that a murder has occurred at all. The death was meant to be recorded as an accident, a tragic consequence of rough weather and bad luck. If not for the glass, it might have succeeded." The glass. The glass. He permitted himself the faintest of smiles, not of satisfaction but of professional recognition, as a chess player might acknowledge a worthy opponent's opening gambit. "They thought of everything except the physics. The scatter pattern betrays them. A glass broken during deceleration falls one way. A glass broken under constant velocity falls another. It is a small thing, a detail that 9 out of 10 investigators would overlook entirely. But it is the thread, Watson. Pull it, and the entire fabrication unravels." He turned from the window. His eyes were bright, his jaw set, his entire bearing transformed from the languid traveller of the previous evening into the instrument of relentless inquiry that I had seen solve 100 impossible cases. "This was not an accident," he said. "This was murder, and a rather clever one. But cleverness, in my experience, is the criminal's most dangerous indulgence. It leaves fingerprints of its own." He reached for his pipe. "Now then, it is time to speak with the passengers." Chapter 5. Passengers with Secrets. The dining car had been repurposed for the occasion. Gruber had set a single table with 2 chairs facing a third, an arrangement that resembled a courtroom dock. Morning light fell through the windows in pale columns. Holmes stood by the window, his back to the light, his face in shadow, a deliberate positioning that forced the person opposite to squint while his own expression remained unreadable. I sat to one side with my notebook. Colonel Rathbone was the first to be summoned, and he arrived as though marching to a tribunal. He sat with military rigidity, his hands flat upon the table, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like cords. He had dressed impeccably, polished boots, pressed jacket, regimental tie, as though armouring himself for battle. "I will be blunt, Colonel," Holmes began. "Arthur Bellamy was murdered last night. I'm investigating the circumstances. Your cooperation is requested." Rathbone's expression did not change. "Murdered. You are certain?" "Entirely." A silence. Then, "Ask your questions." "Your relationship with Mr. Bellamy." "Casual acquaintance. We moved in overlapping circles. London clubs, continental travel, nothing more." And yet, Bellamy possessed certain information about your military record, information you would prefer to remain private. The effect was immediate. Rathbone's composure cracked, not dramatically but visibly. His fingers, flat on the table, curled inward. His eyes, which had been fixed on Holmes with soldierly steadiness, dropped to the tablecloth. "Who told you that?" "No one told me. Bellamy's papers are quite comprehensive." This was, I knew, a calculated risk. Holmes had only glanced at Bellamy's documents, but the bluff struck home. "It was a retreat," Rathbone said, his voice dropping to a register barely above a whisper. "Peshawar, 1881. I gave the order. Men died. The incident was investigated, and the findings were sealed. Bellamy obtained copies through channels I cannot identify. He had been using them for leverage. Blackmail. I would not use that word, but he made it clear that my cooperation in certain financial matters would ensure the documents remained sealed. His jaw tightened further. I despise the man. I will not pretend otherwise. "Your movements last night, Colonel, after you left the dining car." "I returned to my compartment at approximately 11 o'clock. I remained there until the breaking." "Can anyone corroborate this?" "No. I was alone." Holmes nodded slowly. "And the revolver in your trunk, Colonel?" Rathbone stiffened. "It is a personal weapon. I have carried one for 30 years. It has nothing to do with this matter." "Bellamy was not shot," Holmes conceded. "But a man who carries a firearm aboard a train where a murder has occurred will understand why the question must be asked." Rathbone left with the measured stride of a man holding himself together by will alone. He had motive, no alibi, a compartment in Bellamy's carriage, and a weapon. "He is hiding something," I said. "He is hiding a great deal," Holmes replied, "but the question is whether he is hiding a murder or merely a disgrace. The two are not the same thing." He turned to the window. "Send in Dr. Price." The physician entered like a man approaching the gallows. His forehead bore a plaster from the breaking, and his hands trembled around his coffee cup. "Dr. Price, you told the conductor last night that you remained in the dining car until 11:30. The steward's account contradicts this." "He recalls you leaving at 10 minutes to 11. Price's face drained of colour. "Aye, the steward must be mistaken." "The steward keeps a meticulous account of his service. He is not mistaken. You left the dining car 40 minutes earlier than you claimed. Where did you go?" The silence that followed was excruciating. Price stared at his coffee, at the table, at the window, at everything except Holmes. His lips moved twice before sound emerged. "I went to my compartment," he said at last, "for medicine. I have a gastric condition, a private matter, and I required a preparation from my bag. I was embarrassed. A physician who cannot manage his own stomach is hardly an advertisement for his profession." "And the 40 minutes?" "The complaint was severe. I remained in my compartment until I felt well enough to return. I did not return. I fell asleep." "A convenient sleep, Doctor, during which a man was murdered in the next carriage." "I had nothing to do with Bellamy's death." The outburst was sharp, desperate. Yes, the man owed me money, a considerable sum, over £2,000, but it was a private debt, a personal matter, and I would hardly kill a man over. He stopped. He had revealed more than he intended. "Over £2,000, Holmes repeated mildly. "A significant sum. How did the debt originate?" Price's face flushed crimson. "It was a gambling debt. Bellamy introduced me to a card game at his club. I lost badly. He offered to lend me the amount, and I accepted. He subsequently refused all repayment terms. He enjoyed the hold it gave him." "Another man held in Bellamy's grip," Holmes murmured as Price departed, mopping his brow with his handkerchief. "The dead man was collecting people like a spider collects flies." Sophie Delacroix entered next, and she entered fighting. "I did not kill him. she announced before she had fully sat down. I wanted to. I fantasized about it. But I did not. An admirably direct opening, Holmes said. Perhaps you will be equally direct about the letter. Her composure, such as it was, faltered. What letter? Holmes produced a folded sheet from his inner pocket. He had found it among Bellamy's papers during his morning examination. I had not seen him take it, which was entirely characteristic. He unfolded it and read aloud. You will pay for what you have done. I will see to it that you are exposed for the fraud and the liar that you are, and if justice fails, and I shall find another way. Signed with the initials SD. Sophie's chin lifted. I wrote it. I meant every word. The man sold me a forged painting, a work he swore was authentic. I displayed it at a gallery showing in Lyon. When the forgery was discovered, my reputation was destroyed. I lost clients, commissions, 2 years of work. He ruined me and felt nothing. A powerful motive for murder. A powerful motive for justice. I wanted him humiliated, not dead. Dead men cannot be publicly disgraced. She met his gaze without flinching. I was in the observation car from 10:30 until the breaking. 2 passengers were with me the entire time. Holmes nodded. I shall confirm this. She left with her head high. Holmes watched her go with what I took to be respect. Her alibi will hold. While the observation car is at the far end of the train, she could not have reached Bellamy's compartment and returned without being missed. Victor Holden entered the dining car with the unhurried ease of a man attending a business meeting. He sat, adjusted his cuffs, and offered Holmes a courteous nod. A dreadful business, he said. I understand Bellamy and I were observed arguing last evening. I wish to assure you it was nothing of consequence, a minor disagreement about a mutual investment. These things happen in the financial world. Indeed. And after dinner? I retired to my compartment. I read for a time and then slept. I was woken by the breaking, like everyone else. Your compartment is in the second carriage, some distance from Bellamy's. It is. I'm afraid I can offer nothing useful regarding movements in his section of the train. Holmes studied him for a long moment. Holden met the gaze without discomfort, without, in fact, any discernible reaction at all. His composure was flawless, his manner cooperative, his answers precise and unremarkable. He was, in every outward respect, the least suspicious person on the train. "Thank you, Herr Holden," Holmes said. "That will be all for now." Holden departed. Holmes said nothing for several seconds, then very quietly, "That man is lying. I cannot yet prove it, but he is lying." Elena Varga was the last to be interviewed, and she arrived as though attending a salon. She sat with easy grace, accepted coffee, and regarded Holmes with an expression of gentle sorrow. Poor Mr. Bellamy. We were acquainted years ago. We had a romantic connection, brief and regrettable. We parted on poor terms. I had no wish to see him on this journey, and I did not seek him out. You did not visit his compartment last night? I did not. You retired to your own compartment after leaving the dining car at 11:15, and you remained there? That is correct. I read for a time and then slept. Holmes nodded. His expression betrayed nothing. The interview lasted barely 5 minutes, the shortest of the 5. Elena departed with a murmured expression of sympathy for the dead man, and a graceful inclination of her head. When she was gone, Holmes stood at the window for a long time. The Colonel has the strongest motive, blackmail over a military disgrace that would destroy him, I said, reviewing my notes. He has no alibi. Now he occupies the same carriage and he carries a weapon. Surely he must be our primary suspect. He is certainly the most obvious suspect, Holmes replied, and that, Watson, is precisely what troubles me. The most obvious answer to a carefully constructed puzzle is rarely the correct one. He paused. Still, I cannot ignore the evidence as it stands. The Colonel has much to answer for. He turned from the window. Outside, the train had emerged from the mountain pass into a wide, snow-covered valley. Bright sunlight blazed off the white landscape, and for the first time since our departure, the sky was clear. 5 passengers, Holmes said. 5 secrets. A blackmailer, a debtor, a defrauded artist, a banker with an argument, and an old lover who claims indifference. Every one of them had reason to wish Bellamy harm. But only one of them, or perhaps more than one, acted upon it. He reached for his hat. "Come, Watson. I wish to examine the compartment once more. There is a scent in that room that I must identify, and I believe I know now where I have encountered it before." Chapter 6. The Perfume Clue. Holmes returned to Bellamy's compartment for the 3rd time that morning, with the air of a man who has nearly solved a puzzle and requires only one final piece to complete the picture. Gruber admitted us without argument. He had aged visibly since the previous evening, hollowed eyes, shaking hands. The body had been covered more carefully, the white sheet tucked with the only kindness left available. Holmes thanked him and closed the door. Morning sun pressed through the frosted window, casting clinical light upon every surface: the blood-darkened carpet, the scattered glass, the dust circle where the ashtray had stood. Holmes did not go to the glass. He did not examine the desk, the door latch, or the body. Instead, he stood in the centre of the compartment, closed his eyes, and inhaled. He held the breath for several seconds. Then he exhaled slowly and opened his eyes. "There," he said, faint but unmistakable. Beneath the blood, beneath the carbolic acid from Dr. Price's examination, beneath the stale air and the coal dust from the ventilation, there it is. What is it? A perfume, Watson. A very particular perfume. He inhaled again, his nostrils flaring with the delicacy of a sommelier assessing a wine. Tuberose, black amber, and something else. A base note of sandalwood, I think, which gives it that lingering quality. It is not a French perfume. The composition is too warm, too heavy for the Parisian houses. It is Hungarian. I felt a cold sensation in the pit of my stomach. Elena Varga. Precisely. I noted this scent 3 times yesterday evening. First, when Madame Varga passed our compartment during boarding. Second, when she sat at our table in the dining car. Third, when we passed her compartment in the corridor and detected it lingering outside her door. He paused. And now a 4th time. Here, in the compartment of a dead man whose door she claims never to have entered. He moved slowly around the room, testing the air in different locations. He crouched near the upholstered chair where Bellamy had been sitting, and the intensity of his expression sharpened. "It is strongest here," he said, indicating the chair and the space immediately to its left, the side facing the window, away from the door. She stood here, close to him, on the side that would place Bellamy's back toward the door. I understood the implication at once. If Eleanor had positioned herself to Bellamy's left, facing the window, his attention would have been directed toward her and away from the compartment door behind him. Anyone entering through that door, through the scratched latch eased open from the corridor, would have had a clear approach to the back of Bellamy's head. Holmes did not articulate this. He merely noted the scent's location, marked something in his mental catalogue, and stood. "Watson, I must ask you to perform a small but essential task. I need you to speak with the steward, discreetly, and inquire whether any of the female passengers aboard this train wear a distinctive perfume. I am particularly interested in any scent that lingers in the corridors after its wearer has passed." I confess I found the assignment uncomfortable. Inquiring about a lady's perfume felt intrusive, even ungentlemanly. But I had learned to trust Holmes's methods, however peculiar they might seem, and I set about the task with what discretion I could manage. The steward, a lean man named Fisher, proved helpful. When I mentioned a friend searching for a particular continental perfume, Fisher smiled knowingly. You are thinking of the Hungarian lady, Madame Varga. Her perfume is remarkable. It fills the corridor when she passes. Quite unlike anything the French or English ladies wear. I returned to Holmes with this confirmation. He received it with a brief nod and announced his intention to visit Elena Varga. We found her in her compartment. She answered Holmes's knock with unhurried composure, and if our appearance at her door surprised her, she concealed it entirely. She was dressed for the day in a gown of deep burgundy, her dark hair arranged with theatrical precision, and she regarded Holmes with the pleasant, guarded expression of a woman accustomed to receiving admirers. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, how may I help you?" "A brief conversation, Madame Varga, if you would permit it. I shall not take much of your time." She stepped back and gestured us inside. Her compartment was the mirror image of Bellamy's. The same mahogany panelling, the same velvet upholstery, but immaculately ordered, every surface precise, every object in its place. The brass ashtray, I noted, was present on her side table, bearing the railway company's monogrammed crest. A novel lay open on the berth, its spine carefully cracked to mark the page, and the air was saturated with that perfume, rich, warm, inescapable. Holmes was courteous. He complimented the compartment, asked about her upcoming performance in Vienna, and inquired with apparent casualness about the challenges of winter travel for a singer's voice. Eleanor answered with grace and wit, and for several minutes the exchange resembled nothing more than a pleasant social call between acquaintances. Then Holmes shifted. "I notice you wear a most unusual scent, Madame Varga. Tuberose and black amber, if I'm not mistaken." "A Hungarian blend," Eleanor smiled. "You have a remarkable nose, Mr. Holmes." "I do, which is why I find it curious that your perfume lingers quite distinctly in Mr. Bellamy's compartment, though you tell me you did not visit him last night." The smile held, but something behind it changed. It was not a collapse of composure. Eleanor was far too skilled a performer for that, but a tightening, a subtle recalibration, as though a mechanism behind her eyes had engaged a different gear. She was still smiling, still poised, still perfectly at ease, but she was now unmistakably on guard. "Perhaps it drifted through the corridor," she said, her tone light. "These trains are poorly ventilated. Scents travel through the gaps between doors and walls. I'm told my perfume is rather persistent." "It is persistent indeed," Holmes agreed. Persistent enough, in fact, to concentrate in a specific location within the compartment, beside the upholstered chair, on the side facing the window. An unusual pattern for a scent that merely drifted through the ventilation. A silence. Eleanor held Holmes's gaze. Her dark eyes were steady, but I could see at the corners of her mouth the faintest tremor of effort, the effort of a performance maintained under pressure. "I cannot account for the behaviour of perfume in enclosed spaces, Mr. Holmes. I can only repeat that I did not enter Mr. Bellamy's compartment." Holmes nodded, as though accepting the answer. He turned the conversation to lighter matters, the quality of the train's linen, the view from the mountain pass. Eleanor relaxed fractionally, and then, with the practised ease of a man who understands the value of a seemingly careless remark, Holmes said, "It must have been a dreadful shock hearing of Bellamy's death, particularly given your past acquaintance. I understand the two of you were quite close." "Years ago," Eleanor said. "A lifetime ago. We were different people then. And yet, here you were, on the same train. A coincidence. The world of continental travel is smaller than one might think." "Indeed. Tell me, when you knew Bellamy, was he always so careless with his surroundings? The compartment was in some disorder when we found him. Papers everywhere, the writing desk cluttered. One would think a man of his means would travel more tidily." Eleanor shrugged gracefully. "Arthur was never tidy. He kept his papers in chaos and his mind in perfect order. I remember the writing desk in his study at home was always buried. Papers, books, cups, ashtrays. I imagine the writing desk by the window was much the same. She stopped. It was not a dramatic stop, not a gasp or a hand clapped over the mouth. It was subtler than that. A fractional pause, a barely perceptible stiffening of the shoulders, the kind of hesitation that only someone watching very closely would notice. She had said something she had not intended to say, and she knew it. Holmes's expression did not change. He continued as though nothing had happened. Quite so. Bellamy was evidently a man of disordered habits. But I had seen it, and Holmes had seen it, the writing desk by the window. First-class compartments on the Midnight Express came in two configurations. In some, the writing desk was positioned beside the window. In others, it was beside the door. The configurations alternated along the carriage. Bellamy's compartment had the desk by the window, but Elena, who claimed never to have entered the room, had known this, had described the desk's position with the casual specificity of someone who had seen it for herself. We took our leave shortly after. Elena's composure had been restored, but something had shifted between us, an awareness, unspoken, that the conversation had not gone entirely as she had planned. In the corridor, Holmes said nothing until we were well out of earshot. Then he spoke, quietly and with precision. 2 facts, Watson. First, Elena Varga's perfume is present in Bellamy's compartment. She was there. Her denial is a lie. Second, she knows the layout of his compartment, the position of the writing desk relative to the window. She could not know this without having been inside. She might have seen it through the open door as we did. From the corridor, one can see the berth and the chair. The writing desk is around the corner, visible only from within the room. She was inside, Watson. She stood beside the chair on the window side, close enough to saturate the upholstery with her scent, and she lied about it. He walked in silence for several paces. But here is what troubles me, he continued. If Eleanor killed Bellamy, why was she in the compartment at all? The scent places her there, but the wound, the blow to the back of the skull, required a position behind the victim near the door. Eleanor was on the wrong side of the room for the killing blow. She was in front of Bellamy, not behind him. He stopped at the corridor window and stared out at the passing mountains. Unless, he said slowly, she was not the one who struck. He turned to me. His grey eyes were very bright. I need to see the tickets, Watson. Every ticket stub on this train. Chapter 7. The Puzzle of the Tickets. The conductor's office was a cramped cabinet at the forward end of the first-class carriage, barely large enough for 2 men to stand abreast, with a fold-down desk and a rack of pigeonholes stuffed with manifests. Gruber received us with weary resignation. "I require the passenger manifest for this journey," Holmes said, "and every ticket stub collected since departure." Gruber hesitated. "This is most irregular, Mr. Holmes. The railway company—" "A man has been murdered aboard your train, Herr Gruber. The railway company will have far more to answer for if the killer disembarks at the next station and vanishes into Austria. The ticket stubs, if you please." The conductor opened a drawer and produced a small wooden box. Inside, arranged in neat rows, were the punch ticket stubs of every first-class passenger on the Midnight Express. Each bore the passenger's name, compartment number, and the mark of the conductor's punch, a small hole stamped through the card at the time of boarding, confirming that the passenger had been checked into the correct compartment. Holmes spread the stubs across the fold-down desk and produced his magnifying glass. He examined each one in turn, holding it beneath the lamp, tilting it at various angles. I stood behind him, watching, understanding nothing of what he sought. He separated 2 tickets from the rest and placed them side by side. "Herr Gruber, when you punch a ticket, you use this instrument." He indicated a small metal punch hanging from a chain at the conductor's belt. "Yes, monsieur. It is standard issue. Each conductor on this route carries the same model." "May I see it?" Gruber unclipped the punch and handed it over. Holmes examined it under the lens, turning it slowly. studying the cutting edge. Then he held it beside the two separated tickets and compared the holes. "Your punch has a manufacturing defect," Holmes said, "a very slight one, almost invisible to the naked eye. The cutting edge is fractionally irregular on the left side, producing a hole that is not perfectly circular. It has a barely perceptible flat spot at approximately the 10 o'clock position." Gruber peered at the tool. "I have never noticed this." "You would not, unless you were looking for it. But the defect is consistent. Every ticket you have punched bears the same irregular hole." Holmes gestured to the row of stubs on the desk. "These tickets, all of them, show the characteristic flat spot, except two." He held up the separated stubs. I leaned closer. Even under the magnifying glass, the difference was extraordinarily subtle, a matter of fractions of a millimetre. But Holmes was right. The holes in these two tickets were perfectly circular, perfectly symmetrical. They had been punched by a different instrument. "Whose tickets are those?" I asked. Holmes turned them over. The names were written in the conductor's hand on the reverse. Victor Holden, Elena Varga. "Their tickets have been repunched," Holmes said. "Not by your instrument, Herr Gruber, but by another. A pocket-hole punch, I should think, of the kind that can be purchased at any stationer's shop. The holes are clean, symmetrical, and lack the distinctive irregularity of your tool." Gruber stared at the tickets, bewildered. "But I punched all the tickets myself. At boarding, I am certain of it." "You did. And then, at some point after boarding, Halden and Varga exchanged their tickets and re-punched the new ones to match." Holmes laid the stubs flat. "Observe. Halden's ticket assigns him to compartment 12 in the second carriage, on the far side of the train from Bellamy. Varga's ticket assigns her to compartment 7 in the first carriage, also distant from the victim. On paper, neither of them was anywhere near Bellamy's section of the train during the night. But if they exchanged tickets, then Holden was not in compartment 12. He was in compartment 7, Varga's original assignment, which is in the first carriage, the same carriage as Bellamy. And Varga was not in compartment 7, but in compartment 12. However," he held up one finger, "the exchange itself is not what matters most. What matters is this. Between the moment they exchanged tickets and the moment they settled into their new compartments, there is a window of time during which neither of them was where their tickets said they were. Their alibis are fabricated, Watson, built on paper, held together by a pocket-hole punch and the assumption that no one would examine the punch marks closely enough to notice." He gathered the tickets and placed them carefully in his waistcoat pocket. Then he turned to Gruber. "Herr Gruber, I must ask you a further question. At what point during the evening did you last see Holden and Varga in their compartments?" Gruber consulted his memory with visible effort. "I made a round at approximately 10 o'clock before the storm worsened. I saw Madame Varga in compartment 7, or rather, I saw that the light was on and the door was closed. I did not look inside. Herr Halden's compartment 12 was the same. Light on, door shut." "But you did not physically confirm who was inside either compartment?" "No, monsieur. It is not our practice to disturb first-class passengers after the evening round." "Then after 10 o'clock you have no evidence beyond the ticket stubs that Halden and Varga were where they claimed to be?" "No, I suppose not." Holmes thanked the conductor and we withdrew. The train was moving steadily, the mountains giving way to lower valleys. Through the windows I could see villages, snow-covered rooftops, church spires, thin threads of smoke. The next station was perhaps 2 hours away. We returned to our compartment. Holmes closed the door, drew the curtain and sat opposite me. "Let me tell you what happened last night, Watson. Not all of it. There are pieces I still require. But the shape of it is now clear. Elena Varga and Victor Holden are not strangers who happen to board the same train. They are connected, intimately connected. Their relationship is the axis upon which this entire crime turns. After dinner, they met somewhere on the train, a corridor between carriages perhaps, or an empty service compartment. There they exchanged their original tickets and re-punched the new ones with a pocket-hole punch that Holden had brought aboard for precisely this purpose. The exchange was planned in advance. It was not improvised. But why exchange tickets at all, I asked. To create false alibis. Their original compartment assignments placed them in proximity to Bellamy's carriage. By switching, they moved their official positions to the opposite ends of the train, ensuring that if anyone checked the manifest after the murder, neither name would appear near the scene. It is a simple deception, but an effective one, relying on the assumption that ticket stubs are administrative records, not forensic evidence. And then Elena went to Bellamy's compartment. She knocked. He admitted her, an old acquaintance, a former lover. She positioned herself on his left side beside the window, engaging him in conversation, keeping his attention directed toward her and away from the door. While Holden approached from the corridor, forced the latch open, hence the scratch on the door plate, and entered behind Bellamy. Eleanor had left the door slightly ajar to make his entry easier. Bellamy, seated and facing Eleanor, did not see or hear him. Holden struck from behind with a brass ashtray. Bellamy fell forward, his temple striking the desk. He died almost instantly. I sat in silence, absorbing the horror of it. When the image was vivid and terrible, the unsuspecting man, the woman holding his attention with the same charm she had demonstrated to us in the dining car, and behind him, unseen, the measured approach of the man with the ashtray. They staged the scene together, overturned the chair, smashed the glass, arranged the body. Holden took the ashtray and concealed it in his luggage. They left separately and returned to their switched compartments. Then they waited for the storm. And the emergency braking provided the explanation. Precisely. A man found dead after a violent stop, surrounded by broken glass, his head against the corner of a desk. The obvious conclusion is accident. No crime. No investigation. No questions asked. The train arrives at the station. The body is removed. A report is filed. And 2 people walk free. He reached for his pipe and filled it from the Persian slipper he carried in his coat pocket when travelling. We are not looking for a lone killer, Watson. We are looking for a pair. And the partnership between them, the trust, the coordination, the shared willingness to commit murder, tells me that their connection is not recent. They have been in alliance for some time. The question is, what binds them together so tightly that they would risk the gallows? The argument at dinner, I said. Bellamy and Holden. It was about more than a minor business disagreement. It was about survival. Bellamy had evidence, financial documents, correspondence, bank records, that could destroy Holden. He intended to present that evidence to the Austrian authorities upon arrival in Innsbruck. If Bellamy had reached the station alive, Holden faced criminal prosecution and ruin. And Elena? That is what I must now determine. Her connection to Holden, her role in whatever scheme Bellamy threatened to expose, and the nature of the evidence Bellamy carried. The documents in his case will tell us, but I wish to understand the mechanism of the murder before I turn to the motive, the how before the why. He lit his pipe and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. The Colonel can rest easier, he added. His blackmail troubles are real, but they are not why Bellamy died. Bellamy was killed to protect a conspiracy, and the Colonel is not part of it. What now? I asked. Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. Now I must examine Bellamy's financial papers in detail, and then I must find the ashtray. The perfume places Eleanor in the room. The tickets prove the alibis are false. The scratch on the door shows how Holden entered. But without the weapon, the physical instrument of the killing, the case remains circumstantial. He paused. And I do not intend to present a circumstantial case. He rose and reached for his coat. The next station is less than 2 hours away. When this train stops, 2 murderers will attempt to walk off it and disappear. I mean to ensure they do not. Chapter 8. Reconstructing the crime. Holmes spent the better part of the next hour with Bellamy's financial papers. He worked at the writing desk in our own compartment, the document case open before him, sorting correspondence into neat piles with the rapid, precise movements of a man who has handled financial records before and knows exactly what he is looking for. I sat opposite, watching, and saw his expression shift by degrees, from concentration to interest, from interest to grim understanding. "It is worse than I thought," he said at last. He did not look up. Bellamy was not merely a victim of bad business. He was the victim of a sustained and deliberate fraud. These documents tell the story quite clearly. He held up a sheet of headed notepaper. A letter from Bellamy to his solicitor 3 weeks ago. He describes an investment of £12,000 placed with a Viennese banking firm managed by Victor Holden, a continental shipping venture on the basis of prospectuses Holden provided. He took up another document, a bank statement showing Bellamy's funds received and then, within 6 weeks, transferred through subsidiary accounts to a destination corresponding to no shipping company. The money was siphoned, Watson, moved through false accounts and redirected. Embezzlement. On a grand scale, and not from Bellamy alone, these records suggest that multiple investors were defrauded through the same mechanism. Holden was running a scheme of systematic theft, using his position as a private banker to funnel client funds through fictitious ventures. And Elena? Holmes produced a final document, a bank record bearing 2 signatures at the bottom. One was Holden's, in the precise angular script I recognized from his ticket stub. The other was a flowing, dramatic hand. Elena Varga is a co-signatory on 3 of the subsidiary accounts. She is not merely Holden's associate, she is his partner, in the fraud and, I strongly suspect, in every other respect. They are lovers, Watson, lovers and conspirators. The money that passed through those accounts enriched them both. He closed the document case and secured its clasps. Bellamy discovered the theft. He obtained copies of the bank records. How, I do not yet know, but the man had resources and determination. He confronted Holden before this journey, and aboard this train he informed Holden that he intended to present the evidence to the Austrian authorities upon arrival in Innsbruck. Those sealed letters we saw on his desk were addressed to the Staatsanwaltschaft, the public prosecutor's office. And so they killed him. They had no choice, or believed they had none. If Bellamy reached the station alive, both faced prosecution, imprisonment, and ruin. They decided to kill him in transit, where jurisdiction would be ambiguous and the storm could provide cover. It was not a crime of passion, it was a calculated execution. He rose from the desk. Now I must return to Bellamy's compartment one final time. I have the motive and the method. What I need is the last physical confirmation, the proof that Holden was inside that room. We found Gruber at his post. The conductor admitted us with a look that had progressed beyond fatigue into a kind of hollow acquiescence. Holmes thanked him, entered the compartment, and closed the door. The scene was as it had been, the covered body, the darkened blood, the scattered glass. But Holmes was no longer examining the evidence of the crime. He was reconstructing it. "Stand here." Well, Watson. He positioned me beside the upholstered chair on the left side, facing the window. "You are Eleanor. You have entered the compartment on the pretext of settling old grievances with a former lover. Bellamy is seated." He gestured to the chair. "He faces you. His back is toward the door." He moved to the compartment door and eased it open. The scratch on the latch plate caught the light, that thin, bright line in the brass. "I am Holden. I'm in the corridor. Elena has left the door slightly ajar. Not enough to be conspicuous, but enough that I can reach the latch without knocking. He demonstrated, sliding his fingers into the gap between door and frame. I use a thin instrument, a penknife, the edge of a coin, to lever the latch back. The scratch is the result. The door opens silently. He stepped inside, moving with exaggerated care, placing each foot with deliberation. Bellamy does not hear me. He is engaged in conversation with Elena. His attention is entirely upon her. I approach from behind. I am carrying the brass ashtray from the side table. 2 pounds of solid brass, heavy enough to fracture a skull with a single blow. He stood behind the chair, his right arm raised. I strike, here, the base of the skull, the occipital bone. Bellamy collapses forward. His temple hits the corner of the writing desk. Holmes indicated the desk's edge, where a dark stain still marked the point of impact. The desk wound is catastrophic and provides the visible cause of death. The blow to the back of the head, the actual killing strike, is concealed by the hair and the subsequent bleeding from the temple. A physician conducting a cursory examination in the middle of the night, under the assumption of an accident, would note the temple wound and look no further. "Dr. Price," I said. Dr. Price, who was frightened, exhausted, and eager to confirm the obvious explanation. He was not negligent, merely human. You, Watson, with your military experience and your surgeon's eye, noticed the second wound. Price did not. Holmes crouched beside the chair and began to examine the space between the seat cushion and the compartment wall. His fingers probed the narrow gap with methodical patience, working their way along the join from one end to the other. After the blow, he continued as he searched. Holden and Elena work quickly. They have perhaps 5 minutes before the storm may produce the emergency stop they are counting on. They overturn the chair, they smash the glass, dropping it from standing height to produce the non-directional scatter pattern. They arrange Bellamy's body to suggest a forward fall. And then his fingers stopped. His expression changed, a subtle sharpening, the faintest intake of breath. He withdrew his hand from the gap between the cushion and the wall. Between his thumb and forefinger he held a single silver cufflink. It was small but finely made, polished silver, with an engraved monogram on its face. Holmes held it beneath his magnifying glass and read the letters aloud. V. H. Victor Holden. It must have caught on the upholstery as he leaned over Bellamy, Holmes said. The struggle, even a brief one, the involuntary spasm of a dying man, could easily dislodge a cufflink from a sleeve. The Holden would not have noticed in the darkness and the urgency of the staging. He would have noticed afterward, of course. One does not lose a cufflink without eventually registering its absence. But by then it was too late to return to the compartment. Gruber was making his rounds. The body had been discovered. The scene was closed. He placed the cufflink in a small envelope he produced from his pocket and sealed it. V.H., I said. The same monogram as his silver cufflinks, the ones I noticed when he boarded. The very same, and I will wager, Watson, that when we next observe Herr Halden, we shall find him wearing only one cufflink, with the other sleeve carefully folded or adjusted to conceal the absence. He stood and surveyed the compartment with the air of a man completing a final inventory. The case is nearly complete. The glass scatter pattern proves the death occurred before the breaking. It was murder, not accident. The perfume places Elena in the compartment. The ticket switch proves both alibis were fabricated. The door scratch shows how Holden entered. The cufflink places him physically at the scene. The financial documents provide the motive, embezzlement on a grand scale, with exposure imminent. He counted the points on his fingers, then folded his hand. One piece remains, the ashtray, the instrument of the killing itself. Without it, the evidence is compelling, but circumstantial. A clever barrister might construct an alternative narrative around each individual point. The perfume drifted through ventilation. The tickets were exchanged innocently. The cufflink was lost on a previous occasion. But the ashtray, a heavy brass object bearing the railway company's monogram, missing from this compartment and concealed in the luggage of the accused, with traces of the victim's blood in its engraved lettering. That is not circumstantial. That is proof. He moved toward the door. And I know exactly where it is. Holden's valise, I said. Holden's valise. He could not have disposed of it during the night. The windows on this train are sealed against the mountain cold, and the exterior doors are locked during transit. He could not have thrown it from the train. He could not have hidden it in a public space without risk of discovery. It is in his luggage, Watson. It must be. But I cannot simply demand to search a passenger's belongings, not without arousing suspicion and giving him the opportunity to destroy or relocate the evidence. He paused in the doorway, and I recognized the particular stillness that preceded one of his most creative gambits, the moment when the analytical mind gave way to the theatrical one, and Sherlock Holmes the scientist became Sherlock Holmes the strategist. "I need a pretext," he said, "a reason to open every piece of luggage on this train that will seem natural, necessary, and entirely unconnected to the murder." He was silent for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Watson, do you recall whether Bellamy was wearing a pocket watch when we found his body?" I thought back to the scene. Bellamy had been face down, his waistcoat visible beneath his jacket. I had not noticed a watch chain. "I don't believe he was." He was not, and a man of Bellamy's standing would certainly travel with one. The ghost of a smile became something sharper. "I believe a valuable gold pocket watch has gone missing from the deceased's effects. I believe it must have been stolen during the confusion of the emergency stop. And I believe that the conductor, in the interest of the railway company's reputation, should conduct a thorough search of all passenger luggage before the train reaches the next station. Holmes, that watch may never have existed. It need not have existed, Watson. It need only be plausible." He stepped into the corridor. "Come, I must speak with Gruber. We have less than an hour." Chapter 9. The Trap. Gruber required persuading, but Holmes addressed each objection with surgical efficiency. The company would face greater embarrassment if a theft went uninvestigated. The search would be framed as protective, not accusatory. Passengers would understand the necessity. "Announce that a valuable gold pocket watch belonging to the deceased has not been found among his effects," Holmes said. "Express regret. Explain the railway requires an inventory before arrival. You are fulfilling a duty, not accusing anyone." Within 15 minutes, the announcement had been made. Passengers were asked to gather in the dining car while compartments were searched. The reaction was immediate and instructive. Colonel Rathbone received the news with the rigid displeasure of a man who considers his privacy inviolable. "Damned impertinence," he muttered, but he complied, now stalking into the dining car with his jaw set and his arms folded. His anger was genuine and uncomplicated, the anger of a man who has nothing to hide except a private disgrace that has no bearing on a pocket watch. Dr. Price looked relieved. Of all the passengers, he seemed the most at ease with the search, perhaps because, for the first time since the journey began, the focus of suspicion had shifted from timelines and alibis to a simple matter of property. He sat in the dining car with something approaching calm, sipping his coffee with steady hands. Sophie Delacroix was indifferent. She shrugged, collected her sketchbook and took a seat by the window. "Search whatever you like," she said. "I have nothing of his and nothing to fear." It was Holden and Elena who commanded Holmes's attention. Holden entered the dining car with his usual composure, unhurried, courteous, his expression one of mild concern appropriate to the circumstances. He took a seat, adjusted his cuffs, and offered Gruber a sympathetic nod. "A distressing business," he said. "I am happy to cooperate in any way." and then he said, "In fact, I should like to volunteer my luggage to be searched first. I wish to set an example of cooperation for the other passengers." It was a small thing, a gesture of goodwill that might have passed unremarked in any other context. But Holmes, who was standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, registered it with the faintest tightening of his jaw. I understood why. Innocence does not volunteer. Innocence waits its turn. It is guilt that rushes forward, eager to demonstrate transparency, hoping that the appearance of cooperation will forestall scrutiny. I watched Holden's hands as he adjusted his cuffs for the second time. His right sleeve was folded precisely, the cufflink gleaming. His left sleeve was also neatly arranged, but differently. The fold was tighter, drawn further over the wrist, and no cufflink was visible. He had concealed the absence exactly as Holmes had predicted. Eleanor arrived last. She entered the dining car as she entered every room, with the unhurried grace of a woman who knows she is being observed and welcomes it. She sat beside Holden, accepted coffee from the steward, and produced a slim volume of poetry from her handbag, which she opened and began to read with an air of serene patience. She did not react to the announcement of the search. She did not look at Holden. She did not adjust her posture, touch her hair, glance at the corridor, or perform any of the 100 small, involuntary gestures that betray anxiety. She was, in every visible respect, perfectly at ease, and that, as Holmes had observed the night before, was the most suspicious disposition of all. The other passengers were irritated, relieved, indifferent, or angry. Elena was none of these. She was performing tranquillity with the same practiced control she brought to the operatic stage, and the performance was fractionally too perfect, too complete, too sustained, too devoid of the natural imperfections that genuine calm produces. Holmes turned to me. "Observe them both, Watson. Note everything. I am going with Gruber." He left the dining car. I remained seated at a table near the door, my notebook open, my pen in hand. I watched. Over 20 minutes, I noted 3 things about Holden. First, he adjusted his cuffs 4 more times, each time his fingers went to the left wrist, tugging fabric down over the missing cufflink, a nervous habit masquerading as a grooming tic. Second, his eyes moved to the corridor door at intervals of roughly 2 minutes, tracking any movement beyond the dining car. He was dreading something. Third, he did not speak to Eleanor. Not once. They sat side by side like strangers, maintaining the fiction that they were unconnected. The disciplined performance of indifference convinced me more than any single piece of evidence that they were guilty. Elena read her poetry. She turned pages at regular intervals. She sipped coffee. She was impeccable. 35 minutes passed. The train was descending now. The mountains falling away behind us. The valleys widening toward the plains. Through the dining car windows, I could see the first signs of civilization thickening. Roads, farmhouses, the distant spire of a church. The corridor door opened. Holmes entered. I knew immediately from his expression that he had found what he was looking for. It was not triumph. Holmes rarely permitted himself anything so vulgar, but a quiet, absolute certainty, the expression of a man who has placed the final piece of a complex mechanism and heard it click into position. Behind him, Gruber carried a cloth bundle. Holmes walked to the centre of the dining car. Every eye in the room turned to him. The Colonel looked up from his brooding. Dr. Price set down his cup. Sophie closed her sketchbook. Eleanor turned a page of her poetry. Holden did not move, but the colour drained from his face in a slow, steady tide, like water receding from a shore. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes said, "I must inform you that the search has not recovered a pocket watch. It has, however, recovered something rather more significant." He took the bundle from Gruber and set it upon the table. He unfolded the cloth, a white cotton shirt, and revealed what lay within. It was a brass ashtray. Heavy, solidly made, bearing the engraved monogram of the railway company upon its face. It was identical to the ashtrays in every other first-class compartment on the train. Identical, that is, except for one detail. In the grooves of the engraved lettering, where the brass was too deeply cut for casual cleaning to reach, there was a faint dark residue, dried blood, unmistakable to anyone who had seen as much of it as I had in my years of medical practice. This ashtray, Holmes said, was found at the bottom of Herr Holden's valise, wrapped in this shirt beneath his folded clothing. The silence that followed was absolute. It had the quality of a held breath, the entire room suspended in the moment between accusation and response. Holden spoke first. His voice was steady, but the steadiness had the brittle quality of a surface under immense strain. I have no idea how that came to be in my luggage. I rather think you do, Holmes replied. This is absurd. Someone must have placed it there. During the confusion after the breaking, anyone could have accessed my compartment. Your compartment was locked, Herr Holden. You told me so yourself during our interview this morning. You said you retired to your compartment after dinner and remained there until the breaking. If the compartment was locked from inside, no one could have entered to plant evidence. Holden opened his mouth, closed it. The trap had sprung in two directions at once. His own alibi, his own claim of an undisturbed night, had become the cage that held him. If the compartment was locked, no one could have placed the ashtray there. If it was not locked, his alibi was a lie. Either way, the ashtray was his to explain. Eleanor continued to read her poetry. She had not looked up. She had not reacted. The page before her had not turned in several minutes. Holmes regarded them both with the calm, measured attention of a man who has reached the end of a long pursuit and can afford, at last, to be patient. I have a number of additional matters to discuss with the passengers of this train, he said. I shall do so when we arrive at the station, in the presence of the appropriate authorities. He turned to Gruber. Herr Gruber, I would be grateful if you would wire ahead to the next station and request that the police meet the train upon arrival. Gruber nodded and withdrew. Holmes collected the ashtray, rewrapped it carefully in the shirt, and carried it with him to the corridor. I followed. Behind us, the dining car remained in stunned silence. 5 passengers sitting with their secrets, their fears, and, for 2 of them, the dawning recognition that the walls were closing in. In the corridor, Holmes permitted himself a single, quiet exhalation. The case is complete, Watson. Every clue in its place. Every thread drawn tight. He held the wrapped ashtray before him. This is the final proof. Blood in the engraving. It will match Bellamy's. No barrister in Europe can argue coincidence against this. And the pocket watch? Never existed, but it served its purpose admirably. He allowed the faintest of smiles. A fiction, Watson, deployed in the service of truth. I trust you will omit that detail from your account. Through the window, the station was visible now, a small Alpine platform, its roof heavy with snow, its lamps burning in the grey afternoon light. And on the platform, already assembled, stood 3 uniformed officers and a man in a dark overcoat who carried the unmistakable bearing of a detective. Gruber's wire was prompt, Holmes observed. Very good. The train began to slow. The brakes engaged, gently this time, a controlled deceleration that bore no resemblance to the violence of the previous night. The platform crept closer. The officers stood waiting. Holmes tucked the ashtray under his arm and straightened his coat. Come, Watson, it is time to bring this to its conclusion. Chapter 10. The revelation in the dining car. The dining car had never felt so small. Every first-class passenger on the Midnight Express was assembled within it. Outside, snow-covered mountains rolled past beneath brilliant blue sky. The next station was 30 minutes away. Colonel Rathbone sat with arms folded, his expression a rigid mask. Dr. Price fidgeted beside him. Sophie Delacroix occupied a table alone, her sketchbook closed, her dark eyes watchful. At a table near the centre sat Victor Holden and Eleanor Varga, side by side, but not touching. Holden wore an expression of composed, courteous interest. His left sleeve was folded precisely over the wrist. Eleanor sat with the stillness of a portrait, her dark eyes fixed on Holmes. Holmes stood at the window end, his back to the mountains. The silence was absolute. Gruber stood by the corridor door. I sat with my notebook open. Holmes began. "Ladies and gentlemen, I will be brief and I will be precise. Last night, Arthur Bellamy was found dead in his compartment following the emergency braking of this train. The initial conclusion was that he fell during the sudden stop and struck his head upon the writing desk. It was, by all appearances, a tragic accident." He paused. "It was not an accident. Arthur Bellamy was murdered." A murmur passed through the car. The Colonel's jaw tightened. "Doctor." Price's handkerchief crumpled in his fist. Sophie's eyes widened fractionally. The Swiss businessman leaned forward. Holden did not move. Eleanor did not blink. "The proof is in the glass. When a train brakes violently, every unsecured object is thrown forward. A glass broken during such an event scatters fragments with a directional bias. The glass beside Bellamy's body showed no such bias. The fragments dispersed evenly in all directions, consistent with a glass broken at constant speed. It was smashed deliberately before the braking to stage an accident. Bellamy was already dead when this train stopped." He let the statement settle. "Having established that a murder had occurred," Holmes continued, "I was obliged to consider who among the passengers might have committed it. The evidence appeared, at first, to point in several directions." He turned to the Colonel. "Colonel Rathbone, you were being blackmailed by Bellamy over a military disgrace. You had no alibi. You carry a revolver. You had the strongest apparent motive aboard this train. And yet you did not kill him. The weapon was not a firearm. More significantly, Bellamy's death does not serve your interests. The documents exist independently, in the hands of his solicitor. A dead blackmailer is more dangerous than a living one because you can no longer negotiate. You needed Bellamy alive, Colonel." Rathbone inclined his head once and said nothing. "Dr. Price, you lied about your movements to conceal a gastric complaint. Your gambling debt to Bellamy was real, but you had carried it for months without violence. You are a liar, Doctor, but not a killer." Price sagged, but the terror in his eyes was gone. "Mademoiselle Delacroix, your threatening letter was passionate and unambiguous, but your alibi is confirmed by 2 independent witnesses. Your anger was genuine. Your threat was empty." Sophie met his gaze. "I told you. I wanted him ruined, not dead." Holmes turned to face the centre of the car. His gaze settled upon Holden and Elena, and when he spoke again his voice carried a new quality, the cold, measured precision of a man presenting evidence he knows to be irrefutable. "The murder of Arthur Bellamy was committed by 2 people, working in concert for a shared purpose. The killers are Victor Holden and Elena Varga." The silence that followed was absolute. Not shock, the room holding its breath, waiting for the accusation to be built into something undeniable. Holden spoke first. His voice was level, almost amused. "That is a remarkable allegation, Mr. Holmes. I trust you have evidence to support it." "I do." Holmes produced the ticket stubs from his pocket. "These are the ticket stubs for Herr Halden and Madame Varga. Every other ticket collected by the conductor bears punch marks consistent with his tool, which has a distinctive manufacturing defect. These 2 tickets bear punch marks from a different instrument. Halden and Varga exchanged their compartment assignments after boarding and repunched the tickets themselves. The switch placed them on paper in compartments far from Bellamy's carriage. In reality, it placed them in each other's original compartments, with direct access to the victim. This silver cufflink, monogrammed VH, was recovered from between the seat cushion and wall in Bellamy's compartment, dislodged during the murder. He glanced at Holden's wrists. Herr Holden is presently wearing one cufflink. The other sleeve has been adjusted to conceal its absence. Every eye turned to Holden's cuffs. The folded left sleeve was unmistakable. Madame Varga's perfume, a distinctive Hungarian blend, was detected in the compartment, concentrated beside the chair. She was in that room, despite her denial. She also referred to the writing desk by the window, a detail she could not know without having been inside, as the desk is not visible from the corridor. The mechanism was this. At approximately 11:15, Elena entered Bellamy's compartment under the pretext of discussing their past. She positioned herself to his left, holding his attention. Holden entered through the door she had left ajar, forcing the latch, leaving a scratch on the brass plate. He struck Bellamy from behind with the brass ashtray. Bellamy fell forward, his temple striking the desk. Death was nearly instantaneous. They staged the scene, smashed the glass, arranged the body, and waited for the storm to complete their alibi. And the motive? The Colonel's voice was rough. He was watching Holden with an expression of dawning, furious understanding. Financial fraud, Holmes said. Bellamy had invested heavily in a venture managed by Holden. The venture was fictitious. Holden and Varga, who is a co-signatory on multiple subsidiary accounts, siphoned the funds through false accounts. Bellamy discovered the theft. He boarded this train carrying documentary proof and intended to present it to the Austrian public prosecutor upon arrival in Innsbruck. If he had reached the station alive, both Holden and Varga faced prosecution, imprisonment, and total ruin. Holmes produced the brass ashtray, wrapped in cloth, its railway monogram visible, the dark residue in its engraved lettering unmistakable. He set it on the table before Holden. This was recovered from Herr Holden's valise during the luggage search. The engraved lettering contains traces of blood. It is the murder weapon. Holden stared at the ashtray. For the first time his composure fractured, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, visible draining of confidence, as though the mechanism that had sustained his performance was winding down. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, with diminished conviction, "I have no idea how that came to be in my luggage." "I rather think you do," Holmes replied. And then Elena broke. It was not tears. It was fury, sudden, white-hot, directed not at Holmes but at Holden. She turned on him with an expression that stripped away every layer of grace and polish. "I told you to throw it from the window," she said. Her voice was low, trembling, and absolutely clear. "I told you, and you kept it. You wrapped it in your shirt and packed it like a souvenir." The dining car was silent. Holden turned to her, but no words came. The partnership that had committed murder and sustained a flawless performance through 12 hours of investigation collapsed in the space of a single sentence. Her fury had accomplished what evidence alone might not have achieved in court. But she had confessed, not through formal admission, but through an outburst that made denial impossible. Holmes nodded to Gruber. "I believe the police will be waiting at the next station." Gruber moved toward the corridor, his face grey. Holden sat motionless, staring at the ashtray. Elena turned away from him and fixed her gaze upon the window, where the approaching station was now clearly visible. The platform, the buildings, and upon the platform a line of uniformed officers standing in the morning sun. The midnight express began to slow. I closed my notebook. Around us, the other passengers sat in the stunned, exhausted silence of people who have witnessed something they will spend years trying to comprehend. The Colonel rose heavily and left without a word. Dr. Price followed, his face drawn. Sophie remained for a moment, studying Eleanor with an expression I could not read, Not pity precisely, but something adjacent to it. And then she too departed. Holmes stood at the window, watching the station approach. His expression was not triumph, it was the quiet composure of a man who has done what was necessary and takes no pleasure in the doing. "You were right," I said, "from the very beginning. The glass." "The glass," he agreed. "The smallest detail, Watson, the one they could not have predicted, because it required a knowledge of physics that no criminal, however clever, would think to consider. They planned for every human variable, the storm, the braking, the confusion, the assumption of accident, but they could not plan for the laws of motion." The train stopped. Through the window I watched the officers board. Holden and Elena were escorted from the dining car without resistance. Holden in silence, Elena with her chin raised and her eyes fixed ahead, the performance sustained to the very last. Holmes and I remained in the dining car as the platform emptied. The mountains shone white against the blue sky, and the air that seeped through the open doors was sharp and clean and cold. I took out my journal and began to write. The account would take many pages, and I wished to capture every detail while the events were fresh. I wrote the final line that evening in a hotel room in Innsbruck, with the mountains visible through the window and the sound of church bells in the distance. The midnight express carried us through the storm and delivered us, as it always does, to the truth.